Welcome to Translate to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. For years, we've been told that trees are among our strongest ally in the fight against climate change, that forests quietly absorb the carbon dioxide we emit and help keep global warming in check. But new research is beginning to challenge that idea. Scientists are now warning that plants may be absorbing less carbon than expected. And in some cases, forests could even be shifting from carbon sinks to carbon resources. So, what's really happening? Are we pushing nature beyond its limits? And what does that mean for climate targets, corporate net zero goals, and countries like Pakistan already on the front lines of climate stress? To discuss this, we have with us Maha Qasim, CEO, Zero Point, with us today. Hello, Maha. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, for years, trees have been seen as key allies against climate change. What has changed in recent research that suggests that they may be reaching their limits?
Okay, so trees are a natural source of stored carbon. When trees grow, through the process of photosynthesis, they store carbon dioxide in the form of carbohydrates in their biomass, so in their roots, in their trunk, in their leaves. And as trees grow and mature, their ability to absorb carbon actually increases during the growing period. So mature trees are actually able to store a lot more carbon than, let's say, young plants, because they have more biomass to begin with. What's changed recently is that because of climate change, global temperatures are increasing, and this causes, heat stress, drought, which limits the ability of trees to absorb carbon at the rates that they were able to do so before. And what we're seeing now is the increasing frequency of wildfires. And wildfires essentially release in large amounts carbon that has been stored in the biomass of trees over a long period of time. So as a result, the same resources that are considered an asset in the fight against climate change are now essentially the system is turning against us in some cases. This is a global phenomenon, but I think it was most pronounced in the year 2023. And as a result, 2024 was the hottest year on record since climate records have started.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned, that climate change, is of course causing heat stress, and it has indeed, altered the ecosystems as well of all, the natural resources. Now to really understand this, can you walk us through how the carbon sink works, how plants, absorb CO2, and where and why this process is, starting to break down?
So again, just to keep it in very simple terms, I'm sure most people have studied this in grade five. But the process of photosynthesis, it requires three things. So we need carbon dioxide, which trees absorb through their leaves. We need water, which trees absorb through their roots. And then the chemical reaction takes place in the presence of sunlight. So when you have all three things in good amounts, that is when photosynthesis essentially occurs, as a natural chemical process. When this starts to break down is when essentially the balance is lost. So, in periods of extreme heat, the plants try to conserve water by closing down their pores. So, they're not able to absorb carbon dioxide as quickly. This limits photosynthesis. In periods of drought, the plants reduce, there isn't enough water available in the soil for the trees to absorb. So, the natural processes essentially slow down. And this happens with all living things. Even human beings, animals, they cannot function at optimal capacity in extreme temperatures. So, during heat waves, our body's ability to function as normal slows down. We feel more tired. We're dehydrated. The similar thing happens in plants and trees as well. So essentially, because of the external environment, the external changes, not having enough water, not having enough or the optimal temperatures to operate, the entire process essentially loses its balance. And that is when the process starts to break down.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for, explaining this to us. And just to break this down a bit further, when scientists say that plants are absorbing less carbon than expected, what does it actually mean, in simple terms? And is this like a temporary slowdown or something that's, becoming more permanent and structural?
Um, so yes, plants, I mean, we're looking at forests at a global perspective, right? So globally, what we're seeing is that in some parts of the world, because of the external environment, due to the increasing frequency of wildfires, the net emissions increase has actually it's no longer being offset by the amount of carbon that the trees were able to absorb. So what wildfires, these are basically extreme events when basically thousands or even millions of trees burn, and when trees burn, they release not only stored carbon dioxide but also methane and nitrous oxides, which are more potent greenhouse gases, right, back into the atmosphere. So it's much more destructive versus the gradual kind of degradation of trees or like a natural kind of lifespan, right? So let's say a 50-year-old tree naturally dies. Um, it will take a longer time versus a wildfire, which is a very short-term event, let's say over a period of a few days or weeks, when large amounts of carbon are suddenly released back into the atmosphere. So that process is it's concerning because again, climate change is happening as we speak. So a large wildfire event can release literally a year's worth of emissions stored within a period of a few days. So, in that sense, again, the balance is lost. And that is why it is so concerning, I think, at a time like this, when we're already at kind of peak emissions, we're still continuing to consume fossil fuels. We're not really meeting our net zero targets or goals. Yeah.
I think, yeah, as you mentioned, the balance indeed is lost. If you look at the global atmosphere also right now, with what's happening, what is happening. So on both sides, when we talk about climate change, the impact of this war will actually be extremely destructive for the world because the amount of heat, like you mentioned, and the amount of carbon, that's been released, it's enormous, when we talk about that. So bringing that a little closer to home in countries like Pakistan, Pakistan faces water scarcity and heat stress. How effective are, large scale tree planting projects? And can trees here still absorb carbon at the same rate as before?
So in Pakistan, we're seeing an interesting trajectory. Less than 5% of Pakistan's land is naturally forested. So I think one of the big interventions that were undertaken by successive governments was to restore our degraded forests. And I would say this was considered one of the greatest success stories, particularly because it was monitored through an international third party. The World Economic Forum was involved. It was part of the Red Plus projects, which is reducing emissions through deforestation and degradation. So there were significant resources that were spent in terms of monitoring the health of these forests. So it's not just a one-off plantation, it's a longer term project over a period of 10 years, 20 years to not only plant new trees, but also preserve existing forests and help the forest regenerate organically. So it has to be done very strategically. There needs to be a focus on, only planting native trees, not introducing, foreign species or invasive species, because that can throw the system out of balance again. And, native trees have the best chance of survival in because they're already well adapted to our climate, to our temperatures, to our water conditions. So I mean, local trees are naturally more drought resistant, more climate resistant because they've over the period of years adapted to these conditions. So and this can even be within Pakistan. So a tree that might survive in Sindh might not survive in the northern areas. So this because different tree species are well adapted to different types of climates. So I think we have to be very mindful of that when we're undertaking any sort of reforestation or tree plantation project. And also the trees need to be nurtured for the first 5 to 10 years of their lives because that is when they need a lot of support in the form of having adequate water sources available. That's when they're developing their root systems. So that kind of monitoring, I think, is really important, especially during the early growth phases of trees. Once they reach a certain maturity level, let's say 10 years, that is when you can kind of you know help them become more independent. It's like helping any biological entity grow. So, I mean, I think Pakistan did a relatively good job with some of their tree preservation projects. I think it's also important, though, that we continue to maintain and preserve and monitor the health of our forests. So it shouldn't be a one-off kind of intervention, like 2010 is the year of tree plantation, and then we forget about it for the next 5 years. It has to be a consistent and a long-term effort.
You just mentioned that Pakistan did a, good job with its tree preservation projects, and you also mentioned that there's a project that's a success story in Pakistan as well. So, just staying in Pakistan, the government has, of course, invested heavily in initiatives like, the Billion Tree Tsunami. How effective do you think are such projects likely to be in light of this new research?
So the Billion Tree Tsunami Project, I think it was started around 10, 12 years ago. When it was started, it was, I mean, I would say strategically managed. There were international teams coming in to do the monitoring, and now you can do it remotely as well using tools like GIS and, remote monitoring systems. Um, I am not sure what the current status of the project is today, if it's still kind of continuing to be done through international third parties. I think the momentum definitely did slow down in terms of other priorities for the government in recent years. But definitely, I think that the design of the project, the way the local communities were involved and trained in being made kind of stakeholders for the project's success, I think that was a really important strategic initiative from the government as well. It helped provide jobs for local communities. It helped them take ownership of forests as a shared community resource. So I think a lot of things were done right, particularly at the project design stage. We've had similar success with, the Delta Blue Carbon project in Sindh as well. This is the mangrove restoration project, which again has been an international success story. The carbon credits generated through these projects are being sold to international third parties, and they've really, financially benefited the partners involved as well. So I do think there is a lot of potential to preserve forests both as a national resource, but also as um, like a good source of just preserving our natural heritage and our ecological systems.
Definitely, the Billion Tree Tsunami Project was actually a success story within, the civil society as well, because I think that was a project that really brought awareness, when it comes to climate change, and it really, started the tide within the youngsters as well.
Yeah.
So there's also something that's called, the CO2 fertilization effect, the idea that more carbon should help plants grow faster. Why isn't that working effectively anymore?
So as I mentioned, there are three ingredients that you need for
Yeah.
successful photosynthesis. So, I mean, carbon dioxide is one of the elements, yes, but then you also need adequate amounts of water and you need a comfortable temperature for the trees to carry out that process effectively. So if two out of those three ingredients are missing or they're out of balance, then uh, infinite amounts of carbon dioxide is not going to help the tree grow any faster if the other two are not available in the right amounts, in the right balance, or even in the right range. So I think that is again where the process kind of breaks down. We need to think about natural biological limits as well. So trees, of course, they can grow to a certain height, to a certain biomass, but they cannot grow indefinitely. When we talk about the CO2
Yeah.
fertilization effect, it's very similar to how we keep applying, artificial fertilizers to crops. So it helps the crops grow very quickly in a short period of time, but then, they're harvested and they're cultivated, and it becomes basically it's time for the next cropping season to start. So yes, I mean, it can help maybe for a short period of time to help plants grow very quickly over a short period of time. But if you want long-term growth, mature trees, trees that store biomass for a significant period of time, just fertilizing it with carbon dioxide is not enough. Like I said, the other elements also need to be available in balanced amounts.
Course. And in today's world, we're seeing that climate change is impacting everyone, and climate change is, impacting all of our ecosystems as well. So we also touched upon this before as well, where we spoke about how Pakistan, faces heat stress and water scarcity. Can you touch upon how, these environmental stresses like, heat, drought, and wildfires, they interfere with the plant's ability to absorb and store carbon globally as well, because it's not Pakistan, globally also so many other countries are facing climate change.
Yes, definitely. So, if you remember in 2022, in Balochistan, there we have wild pine forests in the Shirani region of Balochistan, and this is the first year when these forests caught fire. This was in May, and this was followed by a prolonged period of drought in April. So, as a result, the wood of the trees became very dry, very brittle, and this has never happened before. So these trees were, I mean, they're more than 100 years old. They produce pine nuts, which are a very valuable, export product for Pakistan as well. And essentially, these trees went up in flames over a period of a week. Pakistan did not have the capabilities to fight these fires. I think again, it wasn't a threat that had been seen before. So again, we were very underprepared for dealing with a forest fire, in this specific area as well. So I mean, globally as well, sometimes these things are very hard to control. In parts of Australia, in parts of Canada, in the northern areas as well, because the scale of forest fires is so massive. Human capabilities to address this are very limited, and it's also dangerous, of course. You don't have enough water, you don't have enough sources to, fight these fires with the tools that are currently available to us. Sometimes, yes, they've been successful through, cloud seeding, causing artificial rains to fall, but again, these things take time. They're still at very experimental sources. And, when it comes to weather and climate patterns, there are a multitude of factors that are at play that impact climate and weather patterns. You might be familiar with climate tipping points. So what we're seeing, in let's say the Arctic, poles or the Antarctic poles, even that has the ability to impact weather patterns in countries like Pakistan. So recently, I was just reading about this. The Arctic ice sheets are melting at an unprecedented pace. Because of that, there's a large amount of fresh water that is entering the oceans. It's upsetting the balance of ocean currents because oceans are inherently salty, so that ocean circulation currents are also changing, and that can directly impact weather patterns, right? So the direction of winds, the how clouds are formed, and this is directly impacting even the Amazon rainforests. So previously, I mean, these are very lush green rainforests. They're one of the biggest carbon sinks for the earth, for the world as a whole. But in the years 2023 and 2024, because of, again, extreme heat, drought in some cases, even these forests have been impacted. Parts of the Amazon are turning into savanna. So literally, beyond a certain threshold, if you exceed a certain temperature, the trees die off in large amounts. Similar to human beings, right? Like when somebody unfortunately suffers from a heat stress or an extreme heat wave, which we saw in Sindh in 2015, a lot of people died because they just couldn't tolerate the heat. Your system stopped functioning. The same thing happens in forests as well. So when you have this kind of a mass die-off event of trees, it's very hard to revive them again because they're dead. So it has to essentially be replanted, and we need to ensure that they survive. But it's several decades worth of carbon again being lost in such kind of mass die-off events or forest fire events. So it's not something that has a quick fix. Even if we were to plant a billion trees in the next year, it's not going to bring back the decades worth of carbon that was lost in an extreme weather event like a wildfire or a mass kind of die-off of trees.
I think absolutely. I think we need to focus on the line that you're saying that it's decades worth of carbon that's been lost. Because when such events are happening and when climate change is also happening around us, we are focusing more on planting new trees rather than saving the ones that actually exist and preventing them from dying, because it's decades worth of carbon that's going to die
That's
off.
being
So you're
lost.
right. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Um, touching a little bit about the private sector, this also raises, important questions about the private sector. Many companies, they rely on tree planting and carbon offsetting to claim net zero. Does this new research challenge the credibility of those strategies?
Okay, so maybe I'll break it down a bit. So a carbon offset or a carbon credit essentially is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide being stored permanently for a certain period of time, either in a natural carbon sink like a tree, or it could be stored underground, or in limestone or cement or some kind of a permanent fixture that stabilizes atmospheric carbon dioxide in some kind of permanent form. So trees are considered a good way to do this. So offsetting essentially means that the company continues producing emissions because you of course do need energy. You do need to burn fuel to build or to manufacture any product. You need it for transport. You need it for electricity or in energy generation, power generation as well. So the private sector, yes, has started thinking about offsets as sort of a quick fix. Yes, we will continue, producing products, continue growing our value chains, continue increasing production, and of course, consumers keep increasing consumption as well. So that I think is where the challenge lies. We cannot indefinitely continue producing and consuming because it's not sustainable. And I think everyone needs to realize that we cannot continue producing and consuming at current rates because it is not sustainable. And we can't expect offsets in form of, tree plantations to continue working at optimal capacity because the system has, and we've seen this happen in the last few years, the system has broken down. We need to give it space to recover. We need to give it space to restore its balance so that, we have a chance at limiting the impacts of climate change. And unfortunately, I think the urgency of that is still missing from the private sector. The private sector believes that the continuing patterns of production and consumption, and of course, consumers are to blame as well, continuing to consume and produce at current rates, it's absolutely unsustainable. And until and unless, we recognize that, the first step has to be limiting emissions through limiting production and consumption, through switching to alternate sources of energy. For offsets alone cannot solve the problem. I mean, it's unrealistic to expect that. Without addressing the source of the problem, which is the burning of fossil fuels, I don't think we stand much chance of success at addressing this global climate problem.
Absolutely. I think this concept is being exploited, if we use it in the right manner, of course, a change can come by. But I think it's being used as a substitute by the private sector in many cases where they think that, they can, like you mentioned, emit as much as they want, and then they can just, offset those emissions, which is not technically what the concept is all about, right? So absolutely, there's a lot of role that all the actors in the society can still yet to play. Like the private sector, I think civil society also can play a big role. And of course, but the change has to come from the top tier, right? From the governments and from the big companies that have most of the resources.
Consumers have a very important role to play as well because they are the ones who are. I mean, if the demand for certain types of products is not there, then the private sector will adapt to give consumers what they want or move towards sustainable growth models. Which I mean, it has been proven that it can be done. So I think where we put our money has a very important impact in terms of how the economy's growth model evolves.
Absolutely. And I think we saw this, when the war was going on in Palestine, we saw that, how when consumers boycotted different companies, their stocks fell and their demand actually fell. Those companies that thought that they wouldn't be touched, we actually saw that, consumers have a lot of power. So it is in the hands of the consumers and in the civil society. So finally, when we talk about solutions, what's the difference between simply planting trees and restoring ecosystems? And how important is, forest quality versus just the number of trees, especially in government and corporate-led initiatives?
Okay, so simply planting trees means, we do tree plantation events, let's say in post-monsoon seasons when trees, of course, a lot of water is available as well. So it's a nice awareness raising exercise. I think it's good to, get students together to plant trees. It's a nice community bonding activity as well. But it's equally important, I think, to look at ecosystems as a whole. So, I mean, urban tree plantations are great, but ecosystems are essentially, entire systems with flora, with fauna, with there's a whole balance at play here again. So it's not just trees; it's everything from like your soil quality, your air quality, how the communities interact with their environment, biodiversity. The birds, the insects, the animals that live in a certain ecosystem. So it considers all of these different factors. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in some parts of Pakistan, as well as, I mean, probably other countries as well, we're um, cutting down our native tree species to make room for imported trees just because they look good. We're planting these, and it's actually detrimental to the ecosystem because sometimes these foreign species can be invasive. They can be detrimental for local flora and fauna. They can compete in terms of resources One example of this is, there's this very popular hedge in urban areas, which is very extremely water intensive. In fact, the roots go in so deep that they even burst water pipes. It grows very, very fast. I forget the name of that particular hedge, but it became so popular that every single household in the big societies, the DHAs of, Karachi and Lahore and Islamabad, almost every house had it in front of their, like, as a boundary wall. And this, I mean, pretty soon people realize that this is destroying water sources. It is, very extremely invasive. It's extremely hard to get rid of once it's planted. So it's really important, I think, to be very mindful and to be very strategic about how you undertake any kind of, plantation initiative. Urban tree plantations, I think, it's great. It's a good kind of awareness building exercise, but restoring ecosystems, again, we have to think long term. It can't be a one-off like tree plantation event. We need to take into account how other stakeholders within that ecosystem are using resources, like how is water being used, how is waste being disposed of, what are the food needs of the habitat that lives in that ecosystem, because sometimes the local trees provide nutrients, for insects, for animals, for birds, nesting habitats. So if you cut down, native trees and then replace it with imported trees, the birds will not be comfortable necessarily building nests in a date palm versus a neem tree. It's just a different species, how they've adapted over years. So I think that kind of concept has to be embedded in any kind of ecosystem restoration activity, thinking about all the users of that space, of that ecosystem, rather than just focusing on the human element or the environmental element.
Absolutely. You're right about that. I think we need to focus more on action. Awareness is there now on a lot of levels. And that's how the movement starts, right? So we need to focus more on action, and we need to focus more on preserving what we have and preserving our nature, especially, in Pakistan. Thank you so much, Maha, for your brilliant insights. What's becoming clear is that while trees and forests remain vital, they're not a silver bullet. Their ability to absorb carbon depends on complex, fragile systems now under increasing strain from rising temperatures, water scarcity, and human activity. For governments, companies, and individuals alike, this is a moment of reckoning. Relying too heavily on nature to offset emissions may no longer be enough. The focus must shift towards deeper, faster emission cuts alongside smarter, more resilient systems to restore ecosystems. Because the real question is no longer how much nature can save us, but how quickly are we willing to act?